Thank you. Please be seated. All right, we're on the record. This is case number CR 24-131, the state versus Brian Wasson. The state is represented by Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General Mike Guinan. The defendant is present with his attorney, Maren Chalupka. We are here for sentencing today. We're here for sentencing on the charges of unlawful theft by taking value greater than $5,000. Mr. Wasson, you were found guilty of these offenses on March 5th, 2024, and a pre-sentence investigation was ordered at that time. Have the parties had the opportunity to review the PSI, Mr. Guinan?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Chalupka?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Are there any amendments, corrections, or changes to the PSI, Mr. Guinan?
Not from the state, Judge.
Ms. Chalupka?
A few. In the pre-sentence report, there is a claim from the Scottsbluff Police Department that Mr. Wasson had stolen, in addition to the fentanyl and cash that was part of his conviction and the methamphetamine that he confessed to, that he had also stolen cocaine. We would object to that. It's not consistent with the independent audit report of the State Patrol. And we would note, there was just, the court would find reports, or a report from the State Patrol in there that in which Investigator Miller had noted that there is other evidence that may be missing, but it's not consistent with what he had found to be tied to Mr. Wasson, and maybe missing due to other reasons relating to evidence management or something else like that. So we would make that one note. The other note that I would make about the pre-sentence report is a smaller correction. I think Chief Spencer had said that Mr. Wasson had wrote a check for $5,000. This is a small, but I just want to be accurate on the record. He brought $5,280 in cash to his State Patrol interview on September 29th of 2023. So it wasn't a check, and it was slightly more than what was noted. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Guinan, any response?
No, Your Honor, I think those are accurate. Both of those are accurate statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luca. I did notice those discrepancies, and I will let you know that I, in considering what was taken from the evidence room, looked at the report from the State Patrol as well as your response indicating what was missing but not due to the actions of Mr. Wasson, as well as I noted the correct amount for the amount that has been paid or the check that was written.
Thank you.
Thank you. So then moving forward, as so far as sentencing, Mr. Guinan, what is the state's recommendation?
Your Honor, there is I believe, an agreement on the restitution here that, so the $5,280 was, as noted previously, paid back to the police department. There is a balance based on the investigation, slightly over $7,000. I've spoken to Ms. Chalupka this morning, and we've discussed an agreement of just a straight $7,000 total. So there would be a balance of restitution. The parties are in agreement of $1,720.
Okay, thank you. Any other recommendations?
Your Honor, I'll just be making argument at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Luke, I understand that you would like to present some testimony?
Yes, please, Your Honor.
Mr. Guinan, is there any objection to the testimony of Mr. Todd Stoll?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to stay there. We don't have the mic on for the podium, so if you want to go ahead and just have a seat and stay there, that would work. Mr. Stoll, I don't see you. It looks like your camera is off. Oh, my camera's still off. And I'm on mute. Let's fix that. Mr. Stoll, can you hear me? Good morning. Can I have you say something? Make sure we can hear you.
Yes, good morning.
Okay, thank you. I forgot to turn our mic on and our video on, so I apologize. We started the hearing. We're at the point where we're going to ask you some questions, so it's a good thing I noticed that I didn't have the mic on. Ms. Chalupka, I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor, and I'm using my phone to time myself so that I don't go long.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. Dr. Stoll, thank you for being available this morning. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can. Good morning.
Tell us where you're at, please.
I'm between Crete and Denton in the country where I live in Nebraska.
Okay. And would you please, for the record, give us your name and your profession?
Yes, Todd Stull, Toddsstull. I'm a physician, and my specialties are psychiatry and addiction medicine.
What part of your work currently, tell us what does your practice consist of at this time that relates to addiction medicine?
Well, there's a range of things that I do in terms of addiction, and I have through the years, including running various kind of treatment programs for substance use at the university, for example, University of Nebraska Medical Center, as well as private practice. I'm also involved in treating individuals across the spectrum for substance problems, and have spent a fair amount of time treating not only a range of addictions, but especially individuals that have opioid use disorder. I've run opioid treatment programs and including a methadone program, and I was kind of the original individual in Nebraska to prescribe buprenorphine, and I've trained a number of individuals in the state and continue to do so in terms of how to prescribe buprenorphine.
I understand you also chair a statewide committee that relates to opioid treatment. Is that correct?
Correct. I was appointed by the Attorney General and the Department of Health and Human Services to chair the Nebraska Opioid Advisory Committee, which is federal settlement dollars that come to each state, and there are various aspects of the settlement, but the committee's role is to identify kind of areas of need and assessment, and then make recommendations in terms of how the funding is going to be used for Nebraskans or across the state of Nebraska.
Do I understand whether any Scottsbluff County law enforcement professionals serve on that committee with you?
Chief Kevin Spencer does.
Does your work include service to people who have addictions who are high-functioning professionals?
Yes, it does. So high-functioning all the way from kind of professionals such as attorneys, airline pilots, law enforcement, and probably the area that I have most treated at the professional level is physicians. So I've treated them not only for substance problems, but I've kind of seen both sides of that issue because I was chair of the Board of Medicine and Surgery for the state of Nebraska, and most physicians that have troubles with licensure have to do with substance problems. So I have a lot of experience in areas related to treating or evaluating and treating or recommending or providing opinions regarding professions.
So let me ask you foundationally, Dr. Stoll, what is an opioid?
So we all have opioids endogenously. Endogenously means we have our own internal system of opiates, and there are various types of opiates within our body that are just naturally occurring. So an opiate is in essence, when we're talking about this, and sometimes the term opioid and opiates are interchanged along with the word narcotic, and narcotic is largely misunderstood and applied to other areas such as methamphetamine, cocaine. They are not narcotics. Opiates are medicines that occur from a naturally occurring kind of plant, Papaver somniferum, which it means kind of sleepy, if you will, the somniferum part of it does. So it comes from a flowering plant that turns into a pod and then produces these little granular kind of things that are opium. And so opium is a natural kind of product that can be grown, and in the body has a number of effects. Not only we think of it as pain, but it's much broader than pain. It has influence. Opiates, when we take them exogenally, meaning we take a pill, we take a medicine, or take an opiate and ingest it in some means, it will have effects not only on pain, but on our mood, on our thinking, on our what's called our reward circuitry in our within our body. So there's a broad range of effects that opiates have when we take them in, and our own endogenous or internal system.
What are some of the better known opioids that have been prescribed for the treatment of chronic pain?
Hydrocodone and the brand names of hydrocodone, so that's things like Vicodin and Lortab and Lorcet, or oxycodone and the brand names of oxycodone, things like roxicodone and Percocet, and those are probably two common ones. Morphine is another common one. It's the original kind of opiate that was made and manufactured and then turned into a prescription many years ago. So it was kind of the one that everybody compares itself to when it comes to thinking about pain or treatment of pain.
Is fentanyl an opioid?
Fentanyl, so if you think of opiates, there's naturally occurring opiates. Okay, naturally occurring are coming out of those poppy seeds, that I talked about. I'll show a picture here because I have a few things that may help illustrate the points in a minute. The naturally occurring are opium or codeine and morphine. Then you modify it a little bit and you'll get into things that are called semi-synthetic, meaning there's some kind of adjustment chemically made to them in a lab. That's things like heroin and buprenorphine and oxycodone or oxycontin. And then you get into the truly synthetic. They are produced not from opium, but they're manufactured in a lab, and that's things that are like fentanyl or methadone. So methadone is a synthetic or man-made or person-made, if you will, produced opiate.
Has addiction always been a risk of prescription opioid use?
When it was first started, remember, I shouldn't probably say it that way, opiates were used for all kinds of things, right? Years ago, even before the 1914 Harrison Act, they were used to help people sleep. They were mothers would give babies a little bit of tincture of opium or a type of opium in a bottle to calm them down. So they've been around a long time. It wasn't until about the 60s when we found that in New York City, diacetylmorphine, and I say it that way because it comes from morphine, diacetylmorphine is heroin, became a problem. So heroin became a problem in the 60s in the state of New York, and all of a sudden we realized, wow, this substance is pretty potent, much more potent than other opiates, gets into someone's system quick, and all of a sudden people go into withdrawal and they start using more and more of it. So it's not to say there wasn't addiction before that, but it really became noticeable in the 60s, and then there's been gradual evolutions over the last, up until the present moment.
So that may be going to the next question I have is gradual evolutions. When did the medical community start to respond to the risk of opioid use?
Well, it's come in waves. So, heroin was a big issue, and it was responded to by people that, it wasn't just people that had prescription opioid problems. It was, they have a heroin problem and an addiction related to heroin, so let's treat that. And that's when methadone really came into play in the 60s. Methadone still is used frequently now to treat, but shortly after the 2000s, the turn of the century in 2000, we realized that, and started to realize that OxyContin was a problem, and people were dissolving it and injecting it, and becoming addicted to it. And then there started to be progressive research over time, looking at, number one, how addictive are these substances? What are the qualities that determine addiction with regard to the new opiates? And how effective are they at treating what we feel like we're using them for, primarily pain, right? And so it's only been in the last probably 10 years that we've realized that there's been a significant concern around the addictive potential of opiates, and largely fueled by people dying. And so, and I'm not discounting for people that may be interested, in terms of substance problems in the US and worldwide, the biggest problem we have, somehow we just forget about, is tobacco. 8 million people worldwide die year in and year out as a result of tobacco. So those numbers aren't that as big for opiates, but yet there are clearly deaths that happen. So in 2016, the CDC came out with guidelines to say this is how we should use pain medicines, and this lowest dose, short period of time, 3 to 7 days and so on. We shouldn't treat people that kind of have chronic pain, or that was the message that a lot of physicians or people that could prescribe thought was taking place. And what happened then was it scared a lot of physicians, and so they quit prescribing. And now we were not only in the throes at that time of the beginning of the more severe opioid epidemic, now we took people off of them, and there was a greater number of deaths after that. So they came back in 2022 and said, whoops, we kind of made a few missteps, or people misunderstood what we were talking about, and we need to approach this issue different, because there's clearly problems not only with taking someone off abruptly and going into withdrawal, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but relapse and use and problematic issues that occur when someone has an exacerbation or worsening of their pain, worsening of their how their brain is perceiving kind of a withdrawal state, and problematic issues related to changes within how the brain and body work when an opiate is abruptly withdrawn.
Okay, thank you. And I'm keeping an eye on my clock, and I want to keep us within 30 minutes, so I'll move right to asking you to tell us what is it about opioids that causes addiction, and how does it change the neurocircuitry for the person who's addicted, if you can explain that.
Can you see my slide?
Yes, Dr. Stoll.
Okay, let's go here. So I told you I was going to tell you a little bit about this. This is what an opium plant looks like. As it develops, it forms a pod. The pod starts to open, and then you'll see these little seeds down here. Those are opium seeds, so that's a derivative. So it comes from a flowering plant, if you will. So I want everybody to realize the progression of how it develops, and then you manufacture from those little seeds. Either you can use it directly, and that's the kind of tincture of opium or opium itself, or it can be made into codeine or morphine, or it can be modified into other substances that we've talked about. Let's talk about pain. Pain is 100 million people in the US suffer from chronic pain. That's a lot of people, 100 million, right? And it's not just the pain. What happens with these individuals, it leads to a whole bunch of other problems, including sleep disruption. When somebody has disrupted sleep, they're more prone to having anxiety, depression, they're more prone to having cognitive impairment, they're more prone to having mental illness. So you can see when someone has persistent pain, not only does it interfere with their functioning and their sleep, and can be associated with anxiety and depression, but it's strongly associated with substance problems. People want relief from chronic pain, so chronic pain is a big issue. Don't get lost in this slide, it's very detailed. I only want you to look at the red fiber here, or the red line here, excuse me. And this is a vertebrae in a back. Someone has an injury, lower back injury, okay, like what Captain has had, and that pain will be, that signal will be transmitted up into the brain, into this area up here, okay? And as that signal is transmitted up there, it influences our thinking, our thoughts, our emotions, and so on. Let's talk about that in a little more detail. So here's that signal coming up. Here's the brain stem, okay, right here. If we go back, it's coming up, and I'm talking about this area right now. That's traveling up, okay? And as that signal travels up, it gets into the brain stem, and then it gets into this area right here, which is a really important area that's related to all these things that are, say, functions here. Reward meaning pleasurable reward and motivation. All these are in this same area reward, pleasure, movement or motor activity, compulsive activity and behaviors, and pain. They're all that same kind of circuitry right in this area. And that circuitry, think of it as a bunch of wires that are crossing over and overlap, and they send common signals and they communicate together. So it's the same kind of system where there's all this electrical and neurochemical activity that's going on in this part of the brain, right in the middle part of the brain. Hopefully you can see my pointer here where that's at. Let's blow that up. It's this part of the blue where all that's taking place, okay? That with all those wires and everything's crossing over. In the front, this purple area, or this front area here, is where it says prefrontal cortex, the signal hasn't even gotten there yet, right? So it comes up just in that reward, memory, motivation, pain area. That's that area right here. That signal's coming up from down below, and spinal cord gets into an area called the basal ganglia, right? That basal ganglia is where a lot of activity takes place with regard to motivation, pain, and so on. So let's get more detail now. Let's talk about this blue area where it says binge intoxication. When someone ingests a substance that is rewarding to them, that's reinforcing, that creates pleasure or enjoyment, and that's that same circuitry that has pain, right? Then after a period of time, an individual feels euphoric, they feel better, they like the feeling of it, and there are chemicals that are released in that area that are feel-good chemicals. So think of it along the spectrum. If somebody eats a food like carrots, that's not going to create much of a reward. If it's their favorite food, it's going to create more of a reward. If it's something that's more rewarding, say for example sexual activity or drugs or whatever, that the activity in that basal ganglia becomes more rewarding, and when it does so, it overrides our endogenous opioid system in this case. Remember we talked about our own internal system. Now if we're taking it exogenously, if we're injecting it or taking it by mouth and so on, it gets in and creates reward, learning, and memory. Then when it wears off, we go into withdrawal. And withdrawal can be nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle aches, sweating, sleep problems, and so on, and negative emotional states.
Let me interrupt
Okay.
you. Let me interrupt you for a moment there, Doctor.
Yep.
When we're talking about the withdrawal, if someone were to say, Brian Wasson described his withdrawal symptoms as sweats, shaking, flu-like symptoms, and if someone were to say, hey, everyone gets the flu, you just tough it out, and a day or two later you're back to normal, is that frame applicable when we're talking about a 20-year opiate addict?
Let me continue here, and I'll answer that in this process, because it'll make more sense if I continue along our pattern. So somebody goes into withdrawal, the symptoms you just mentioned, one of which is negative emotional tone. Don't forget that, because it's really important. Then, when people are in withdrawal, they start to think, I don't like the way I feel. They start thinking about it. There's a compulsive drive to get out of withdrawal. As this circuit continues to be reinforced, stronger and stronger for longer periods of time, tolerance develops, so people need more of the substance. And as they need more of the substance, here's what happens. And this will get to your question. I'm going to skip this slide because this is really busy. I'm going to go to this one. So what happens initially? In the column, can you see my pointer here?
Yes, Dr. Stoll.
Okay. Initially, someone feels euphoric. They like the good feeling. And after a period of time, when they go into withdrawal, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, shaking, sweating, and not sleeping good, they say, okay, no big deal. It's miserable, but no big deal. They can make it through that. What happens is the circuitry becomes so strong that it creates a new pattern, and most importantly, in addition to those physical symptoms, people, as their addiction progresses, they use not to get high, because they can't get high anymore. It doesn't work that way. They use to avoid the negative emotional states. When someone has the withdrawal symptoms and the negative emotional states, not only does their addiction progress, it is really hard to quit using. Now let's go back here to this slide right here. You see this word salience. There are networks that are formed within our brain. What happens in this network and these connections, and this is how we're wired, as addiction progresses, the brain starts to assign salience, that word means relevance in this context, to new stimuli, to external stimuli. And it focuses on those external stimuli even before it gets into conscious awareness, right? So there's a new incentive, salience, to feel normal by ingesting the substance, and the brain becomes rewired. It becomes, in essence, hijacked in the process, and the signal is so strong. The normal functioning within the brain doesn't work the way it's supposed to, and people keep using because not only the withdrawal symptoms, but now way more important is the withdrawal symptoms associated with a negative emotional tone. That tone is called hypercataphia. I don't expect anybody to remember that, but it's a powerful reinforcement. Let me say it a little differently to put it in context. Let's picture everybody in the room here today, and you haven't eaten anything in 3 or 4 days. Nothing. You've had water, but you haven't eaten anything in 3 or 4 days. And I bring in your favorite food in front of you, and I put it on the desk or the table in front of you, and I say to you, don't eat this. I'll be back a little bit later on, but I don't tell you when, but don't eat it. What happens is a lot of people will say, oh, I have the willpower not to do it. Over a period of time, what happens is that the internal drive to sustain our well-being, to stay alive, becomes so strong, you can't override that by willpower saying, I want to do that. That's what happens when people become addicted to this, they have severe degrees of addiction. That's why we call it a chronic relapsing condition, because people become, that internal signal that's generated, in this case, from the consuming opiates externally is so powerful, because the external opiates are way more potent than our internal, that our brain becomes hijacked and we no longer have the ability to just say, oh, I'm going to suck it up, or I'm going to use willpower here. It doesn't work that way. It's not how we're wired.
Okay.
And so,
let me interrupt you, because I've got like 5 minutes left, Doctor. And so
Yep.
I want you to cover 3 things in the next 5 minutes. And
all right.
One is you've reviewed Brian Wasson's medical records and his law enforcement interview, and you've interviewed him. And so one would be to share your impressions compared to your knowledge of this subject area. The other would be to speak about treatment and what the risks are for somebody. He's now 1 year sober, but what the risks of relapse are, and whether Suboxone or buprenorphine, you're going to pronounce that for me better than I am, whether the medical assisted treatment programs have the potential for success for somebody.
during the tape that I watched with the individual that interviewed him, as well as my interview, Brian was very open, honest, and direct. It was actually quite remarkable, because I'd ask a couple of questions, but he would elaborate in detail, and he elaborated in some ingredients that were particularly important. When you look at outcomes for somebody that has a substance use disorder, okay, and remember we were talking about pain and substance going together, you need to look at 4 ingredients, because the people that do these 4 things have the best outcome. And the outcome is determined by working in some type of treatment program and committing to that. So AA, sponsor, dual diagnosis group, all of which he's doing. The second thing, which is really important, is untreated psychiatric illness, relapse rates or recidivism rates are much greater. He is not only being treated for depression, which is really important because that will determine outcomes, but it influences kind of his ability to cope and manage things as well. So the 4 things are length of time and working in a program, a commitment to program, which he is doing and has been doing. Secondly is untreated mental illness. Outcomes are not as good. He's taking care of that. The third are replacement activities and behaviors. Really important. What are you doing to substitute the time that you were using and the patterns that you were using before? And then the 4th thing that determines outcomes are network, your support. Who cares about you, who wants to help you, who will be there to kind of guide you or support you or hold you accountable in the process. So he's doing all of those things. We knew from years ago, and this has only emerged in the last few years, that the idea and the stigma from our culture of just, somebody needs to be punished for their substance use or for what's going on doesn't work. In fact, they changed the definition and the ingredients to define what is a substance use disorder. And so the legal consequences, in other words, implementing legal consequences for a substance use disorder didn't hold water. It didn't work. In fact, when that happened, individuals didn't get any better. So what individuals need is ongoing treatment, and not only treatment, in his case, my opinion would be treatment indefinitely with Suboxone or buprenorphine. It's like saying to the type 1 diabetic, you don't need insulin anymore. It doesn't work that way. If they don't have it, the chances of them dying are very high. The chances of somebody that has a severe chronic relapsing substance use disorder without ongoing treatment and monitoring, in this case, the programs he's working, and without buprenorphine, relapse rates are very high. And just like when people come out of being incarcerated, if that's an issue that needs to be addressed here, if substance use disorders are not treated when someone's incarcerated, it's still there. And what happens is people think they still have the same kind of ability to tolerate what they were using before. They don't. They go out and they use the amount that they did before, which is too much, and they die as a result of it. So legal consequences as a result of treating an addiction, we found is not effective, and it doesn't help people. What's happened, though, and I'll summarize with this one statement here, is that society is not caught up with the understanding, and so they have the mentality of stigmatizing or branding or being angry about someone having a substance problem. And now we're in an era where we would say, gee, if somebody has a heart attack, we're not angry if they had a heart attack. We show some kind of, how can we help them, what can we do? That's where we're at within the science and the experience, but we haven't provided enough education and understanding to others that are just a part of the mainstream public, if you will, in that context.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate your time, and I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. DeLuca. Mr. Guy, do you have any cross-examination?
I do just have one or two, Doctor. We understand that Mr. Wasson is doing well in his treatment to this point based on your interview and the records that you reviewed, correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us, do these kind of programmings exist in prison? And would he, do you have a sense of how he might do if that was the sentence of the court?
It's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. I appreciate it. So Rhode Island has done exceptionally well in this area. Nebraska has not. We have tried to convince the criminal justice system, if you will, that their outcomes will be better. And I've gone to the state corrections. I've been to various places to talk with them, and we just don't have the support that we need at this point in time to implement a substance treatment programming consistently within the correctional setting. But there's really good data to show it is effective.
I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Chalupa, do you have any redirect?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stoll. That concludes your testimony today. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Ms. Chalupa, any other evidence that you would like to present?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, then I'm going to turn it over for arguments. Mr. Guy, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, there are, as this court is well aware from the PSI, there are a number of positives to be found in the PSI and in the facts in this case. First of all, Mr. Wasson did sustain his injury, a serious back injury, while in the line of duty, while working for the Scottsbluff Police Department, working for this community. That injury led to prescriptions and ultimately to the abuse of prescription drugs, in this case opioids for the most part. As Ms. Jaluka notes in her letters and so on, he did, Mr. Wasson did come forward and fully. He confessed before he was charged, before he was arrested. He sat down with State Patrol Investigator Newmiller and gave around 2-hour interview and fully talked through what he had done over this period of time. He has shown great remorse. He admitted that he stole money, heroin, fentanyl, and right at the end here, when he really lost control, he had stolen meth from the evidence room, which he traded for fentanyl with somebody on the outside. As I think his brother had noted in his letter, he has had 27 years of dedicated service to take into consideration. During that time, Mr. Wasson has worked some big cases for the PD and for this community, including the Hessler case in Mata. All this despite his back injury. There was a quote in one of the letters, maybe it was his brother, "Mistakes do not erase the contributions he made to the Scottsbluff and Garion community and Nebraska." Again, he's taken full responsibility. Here is a man who was on the trajectory to be the chief of police, had spent nearly a quarter century, or maybe just slightly over a quarter century, in law enforcement, and served this community well over those years. Ultimately, he was motivated by addiction as opposed to greed. These were thefts, were not crimes of violence, they were not sexual in nature, they weren't predatory in that sense. And there were a number of letters that indicate he's a good, reliable neighbor, and noted that the public shame that he's brought upon himself is real and will last a lifetime. Of course, there are a number of negatives too within this PSI, as this court is well aware. As at least by the accounting, there were probably around 3 cases around that neighborhood of active cases that were affected by his thefts. One was the triggering, really ultimately the triggering event here that some drugs were not located. There was a couple-day search. Really, at that point, led to ultimately the changes in the procedures for the police department with regard to their evidence room. Chief Spencer had indicated in his letter that Mr. Wasson was a close friend. He was grooming him as the next chief. He did call this the ultimate betrayal. He noted the amount stolen, 43 grams, and this was in the PSI as well, 43 grams of heroin, 209.5 grams of meth, 1,895 fentanyl pills, and slightly over $7,000 in cash. Chief Spencer also noted what really is the problem here, which was the immense damage to public trust and perception. The lost personnel from the department, the hurt morale within the department, and as this court is well aware, he had asked for and felt that a term of imprisonment would be appropriate. Operations Captain Kite also put in a statement, trusted Mr. Wasson for 25 years as a police officer, a close friend and confidant. He tarnished the badge. He felt that he is now nothing more than a thief, a drug dealer with a badge. He repeated the amount stolen and also thought that a prison sentence would be most appropriate. He did wonder how many qualified candidates did not apply given what happened in this case. And the department must rebuild that trust with the community. He had been aware of numerous comments from the community about this case. Captain Brass also very similar. She was involved in that search for that missing methamphetamine. Went on for a couple days. Mr. Wasson himself was involved. That was the one that ultimately led to the dismissal of that case by the county attorney's office. So ultimately, it was kind of the gist or grist that led to this downfall with regard to the property room. She indicated the ongoing law enforcement relation with the community and the public had been problematic for a number of years. And this amplified. She noted the receipt of numerous calls, emails, upset people, and it strained further the relationship that had been in some trouble as of the last couple of years to a few years. She noted that officers who are clearly not involved had been receiving the grief as a result of what happened here. And noted, of course, that Mr. Wasson was a trusted person in a position of power when this occurred. And then lastly, Sergeant Enlow, the supervisor of the Detective Bureau, indicated he looked up to Brian Wasson, saw him as a top cop, a superstar investigator on the drug task force, did not suspect him of the addiction. As recent as 2021, he had no idea, though he had started in that relevant time period working closely, or much more closely than he had been when he was out on the street with Mr. Wasson. He did request cameras to be placed into the, ultimately into the evidence room, and those were put up. He felt that, or indicated that he felt that Mr. Wasson had obfuscated those cameras in part during this investigation, pre-investigation, covering up some of the thefts and so on. And he did note that Mr. Wasson violated his oath of office and the community criticism. So, Your Honor, it's not lost on me, in particular, that that the comments that Mr. Wasson served his community and served his community well for over a quarter century. In fact, I worked a homicide case out here, I suppose, around 15 years ago, and I would have worked with a Brian Wasson who I had no idea was using and apparently abusing opioids at the time. He was an addict, apparently, at that time. I don't know that being an opioid addict and as was indicated by Dr. Stoll, a functioning member of this community, a functioning member of the police department are mutually exclusive. They certainly weren't mutually exclusive at that time, at least. Now, while the thefts themselves did not put the Scottsbluff Police Department out of business, it didn't affect their bottom line. What it did affect is the trust. Not only the trust in the faith in the department with the community, but also the trust and faith within the department between ranks, and then ultimately, maybe most serious, within the command structure, within those who knew Brian Wasson the longest, who worked closest with him. That's a trust and injury that continues on, and that series of trusts and violations are what are the real thing that was lost here. That is the real injury in this case. And those are broad, and those are going to be long-lasting. Brian, to Mr. Wasson, to his credit, did not, as of a year ago now, did not dig a deeper hole. He did start to climb out of that, and he's on that trajectory now. As this court is well aware, being a law enforcement officer is a tough and dangerous profession. It's often thankless. It does tend to employ, or at least lead to, a tough outer shell. Types that have a tough outer shell, they deal with issues internally. They operate with that warrior ethos. And I don't know if Brian Wasson truly had no opportunities for assistance as he went along, as at least the medical records kind of indicate he was not getting the assistance medically. I don't know if he just had no opportunities, or if he missed opportunities, such as some type of counseling and so on. I don't know. I don't also know how he would be judged if he were to be judged today. I don't know if LTV is seen as a man who spent, 25 plus years as a dedicated servant to this community, to this law enforcement department, with the same frailties that we all have as human, or if he'd be viewed as a fraud, a phony, a thief. Ultimately, what I did note, Judge, though, that I thought was well worth bringing to this court's attention, as I know you're aware, whatever sentence this court imposes today, I wanted to draw attention to a couple comments. Ms. Gonzalez, the Community Action Health Center professional, noted, "I look forward to the possibility for Mr. Brian Wasson to be able to speak to other law enforcement that may have problems with alcoholism and drug addiction. He's very wise and helpful to others." Mr. Lordino, the former chief of Shattern, police chief, I've learned and understand through my work as a police officer that those addicted to drugs often fail to remain sober after rehabilitation. In many cases, they make the mistake and do not reach out to those supporting them. And before they know it, they fall from their triggers. Mr. Wasson's daughter Madison noted, although this has been an unfortunate situation, I do fully believe that everyone can come out of it better than they were before. And his daughter Carly also noted what he did was wrong, but it does not define him, not even in the slightest. He is fighting every day. Ultimately, Judge, I think how Mr. Wasson will be judged in this lifetime is not going to be by what brought him here today, but where he goes from here today. On the backside of whatever sentence this court imposes, Mr. Wasson has the opportunity, the unique opportunity, to assist other law enforcement officers. He has gone from a dedicated service career, spent 25 years, he rose through the ranks, handled big cases, and he's had a spectacular fall from grace. He's committed a terrible series of crimes, terrible series of violations of trust, both to the department and to this community. And whether or not he had the opportunity to receive help, he does have the opportunity to give help going forward. I do hope that he would, in the future, find the opportunity and look for the opportunity and search for the opportunity to, as the letters had indicated, go hands-on and help other law enforcement officers in the future that might be in the same shoes. He has a lot to bring to that, and he would bring, I think, make a difference. And if not for here, not for this community, then whatever community, I know that he is looking outside of this community possibly to move at some point. But whatever community he lands in, he has a lot to bring to that community, to those law enforcement officers, which in the end would be a positive out of all of this. That would be the legacy, Judge, that would be worth talking about. I'll submit it.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Ms. Shue? Thank you, Your Honor.
Well, Brian Wasson did not start using opioids at a party. At the time that he started taking opioids, he wasn't taking street drugs at all. He was a patrol officer who fell and broke his back while chasing a criminal over a fence. So he sacrificed his body in service to our community. And when his doctor said, "Take this for the pain so you can keep working," well, in 2002, that was the right thing to do. The medical records in the pre-sentence report show that the court can see how from that day forward, the local medical community kept the opioids coming for Brian. In 2007, the doctors prescribed enough for him to take 6 Vicodin per day, every day. And Brian would visit the doctor for totally unrelated issues, and he would dutifully list what his medications were, and no doctor ever said, "Hey, while you're here, let's take a look at your pain control." Now in 2024, there would be multiple eyes on a running script for opioid medication for 180 Vicodins per month. But Brian was long since hooked under the old prescribing standards that were described today in Dr. Stoll's testimony. And so his addiction progresses beyond what he can get legally. He's exhausted from hiding his addiction, but the stigma of admitting it is worse. And he starts diverting pills from prescription drug takebacks. And from that, his addiction just intensifies. As Dr. Stoll explained, it's never enough. And you're not trying to get high, you're just trying to keep dope sick away. In 2017, Brian tells his primary care doctor here that he is addicted and he needs help. And imagine how scary it must have been for a respected police captain to say, "I have a problem, please help me." And the doctor doesn't help. She tells him that either he has to go to inpatient treatment somewhere, she doesn't really give him any guidance on that, even though he might lose his job, or otherwise he's just going to have to figure it out. She doesn't even cut off his prescription for Norco or find a way to wean him off of it. Now by the same year, the end of that same year, 2017, Brian is wearing 8 fentanyl patches per day at once. That's what it took to keep him from these violent withdrawals. And he begins diverting from the evidence room. He couldn't see any way out. He becomes suicidal. He formulates a plan so that if he dies by suicide, his kids won't find him. As much stigma as there is for any addict, I have to assume it is even worse for someone who's dedicated his adult life to law enforcement and to working with people who use and abuse substances. And it's easy now for me to say, well, he should have just told everyone. But for Brian, as Dr. Stoll has shown us, that wasn't a reality for him. So by December of 22, he's moved from the regular fentanyl to street fentanyl. He's smoking it, he's smoking heroin. And finally, in April of 2023, he learns for the first time that our community has a medically assisted treatment program, which is what he was hoping for when he had talked to his primary care doctor in 2017. Incredibly, he didn't know about it, even though he was a captain in the police department. Which raises a question, at least for me, of what does it say about resources for drug treatment in this community that Brian had to learn about the Suboxone program from his dealer. His drug dealer was the one to say, "I can see that you're in really bad shape. Did you know that there's a Suboxone program in town?" So his addiction nearly killed him, Your Honor, but the only crimes that he committed in his addiction were to feed that addiction. As Mr. Guinan noted, he didn't commit other crimes. He didn't commit assaults or terroristic threats. He didn't start dealing or getting new customers so he could make money or make a profit. He wasn't trying to thwart active cases. And in fact, the county attorney has not written in to confirm how many cases were actually missed or dismissed due to missing drugs. He diverted drugs and cash to feed his addiction. And he kept doing his job well enough that Chief Spencer regarded him as his successor whenever Chief was ready to step away from his post. It was in the full throes of that addiction that Brian Wasson ministered for months to a family that had just lost their husband and their father to suicide. He was cooking their meals, he was getting their furnace fixed on a cold night, he was checking in on each kid regularly. As much pain as Brian carried in his addiction, he still was serving others. And so that's the first point that I am making for this court, is that by granting probation, this court can show that it does matter when addiction is the reason for the crime. Not an excuse, but an explanation. And it does matter when the offender has committed himself to robust participation in recovery. My second reason for asking this court for a grant of probation is confession. We place a high value on confessions. They make our criminal justice system move more expeditiously. And when confessions happen, we discover things, we learn things we need to know, we learn details that we were unaware of. And that happens when an offender gives a voluntary, high-quality confession. At the time Brian confessed, he was not under investigation. The police have noted that in hindsight, it seems like he was asking a lot of questions about the evidence room clean out. But at the time he confessed on September 5th, The police department had not determined at that point that the irregularities in the evidence room were necessarily the result of intentional conduct as opposed to not great management practices. For the clean out of that evidence room to reveal the path to Brian Wasson could have taken a couple weeks, a couple months. It could have taken more time than that, who knows. But on September 5th, Brian made his first confession to diverting drugs to his chief in my presence. And on September 29th, he gave a 2-hour interview to the State Patrol, and it was a voluntary, high-quality, suppression-proof confession. He confessed then that he had also diverted cash, and he provided extensive, credible, corroboratable detail about the flaws in the evidence management system that made his crimes possible. By his confession, Brian allowed for the creation of new checks and balances that had been missing and that are now in place. And so his confession made the evidence management system better. He even confessed to the diversion of hundreds and hundreds of pills from the prescription take-back events that were never logged or tracked in the first place. And so no one would have known that he diverted those pills if not for his confession. Brian gave the name of the dealer that he had bought from at the end of his drug use, and after he gave that name in his interview, that dealer threatened him that he'd better stop talking. Brian emptied his bucket in a way that very few offenders ever do. Now, what he could have done is, if he felt like the noose was closing in, he could have gone to his chief or the officers that were under his supervision and tried to pressure them into closing ranks and protecting him. He could have waited to be appointed chief of police in accordance with Chief Spencer's plans, and then maybe nobody ever would have known. He could have waited to see if anyone confronted him and then just said, "Prove it," and pled not guilty. But he, by that time, had done 4 months of work in a 12-step program to try to rehabilitate, and that work had impressed upon him that in order to stay sober, he had to be faithful to his program, and in order to be faithful to his program, as Brian said to me, "I got to get honest." Now, he also could not bear the thought of being appointed as chief, promoted, and then humiliating his friend, Chief Spencer, if he confessed, or if he was caught, or if he died from an overdose. So Brian put the truth on the table, he confessed, and he cooperated, and he cooperated hard. By giving a voluntary, high-quality confession before anyone knew that a crime had been committed, Brian saved time and money and stress for the state of Nebraska. He saved time and money and stress for this court. No motions, no juror summonses, no suppression hearings, no competency hearings, no trouble. So if we value confession the way that we think we do, then Brian's sentence to probation, if the court will grant it, can incentivize other offenders to confess. And Your Honor can declare that the earlier an offender confesses and cooperates, they can earn leniency. If we send Brian to prison after a voluntary, high-quality confession, I worry that future offenders may take a message of, well, we have nothing to gain if we confess. We might as well just cover up. You know, who cares if it backs up the court system? We have nothing to gain. But this court can declare today that an offender can earn leniency and that the value of their confession will be reflected in the outcome in their sentence. This court can use this case as a model and say that when you ask for help, when you come forward, we're not going to say that there's no consequences, but we will honor your honesty, and you don't have to hide anymore. The last point I want to bring up, Your Honor, goes to the factor in Section 29-2260 of the offender's character. 4 months before he confessed, as I noted, Brian had thrown himself into treatment. As soon as he learned it was available, he was there at Cap 1 wanting to get in. He had one relapse 2 days after he started. He self-reported, and they adjusted how they administered the Suboxone to him. He has been clean ever since. Daily 12-step meetings, treatment groups multiple nights per week, individual counseling, daily urinalysis to show he's complying with the Suboxone program, work with his sponsor, work with a member of our clergy in the recovery community who helps him with the steps. And the step work is what led him to confess. Just last week, Brian earned his 1-year sobriety permit. Now, he remains at risk of relapse. In prison, he will not have those 4 ingredients that Dr. Stoll said are critical to good outcomes. He won't have adequate care for his depression and anxiety. He won't have replacement activities. He won't have his network of support, and if he spends years in prison, likely in protective custody, if we're being realistic, his commitment to his program inevitably will suffer. Dr. Stoll finished his testimony by advising that the highest risk for opioid death is for addicts who leave prison and use at the level after they relapse that they had used before prison. Without that tolerance, their body can't take it. And so going to prison, Your Honor, would severely jeopardize Brian's sobriety. It could risk his life. Now, I've read the remarks of Chief Spencer and Captain Kite and Sergeant Enlow and Captain Brass. They feel betrayed, they should. They worry about embarrassment brought on this department. I do not fault them for those very human feelings. They are hurt, and we know that hurt can come out as anger. The last time that Captain Kite and Chief Spencer saw Brian and me, on that day they were not in a place of anger. It was on the day of his confession, September 5th. And on that day, Chief Spencer and Captain Kite were in a place of compassion. Chief Spencer hugged Brian. He asked me and Riley if we would make sure he was going to be okay. And he told Brian, it's going to be all right. Captain Kite showed compassion and he showed kindness as he performed the very sad task of taking his friend's patrol vehicle and police gear. They showed humanity. So I'm asking this court to balance the understandable anger that Chief Spencer and his captains and his sergeant are feeling now with the feelings that were expressed by the 5 retired law enforcement officers who wrote letters expressing compassion, understanding, and support. Those retired officers have the same respect for the law as Chief Spencer and his captains. And maybe there's something about retirement that frees them to say what police know, that addiction happens to good and decent people. The retired officers have asked this court, as do I, to see that the goodness of Brian Wasson's person is much greater than his crimes, as bad as his crimes were. That he served his community with kindness and fairness and integrity. That his police work was pivotal to closing a horrific murder case. That the only reason that he ever committed any crime was because of an addiction that wasn't his fault. And that the Scottsbluff medical community utterly failed Brian when he asked for help. Now, the retired officers are disappointed in Brian, but they also express confidence in his ability to respond favorably to probation if this court grants him the grace to do so. And under Section 29-2260, the reasons are there to withhold imprisonment and to grant probation, to show that confession matters, that treatment matters, and that character matters. And so if someone asks this court, why did you give Brian Wasson probation? What about the abuse of the public trust? Here's some things the court can tell them. You can say that pleading guilty to 2 felonies and losing his career is hardly a free pass. The court can tell them that the court has the power to show that it matters when you confess before you are even suspected. You can say that the court has the power to recognize when 100% of offenders' crimes are born of his addiction. You can say that the court is authorized to help an offender maintain sobriety and continue treatment under the supervision of probation. The court can say that what Brian Wasson did here is what it, in terms of what he has done to mitigate this problem, is what it takes for an offender to earn probation instead of prison. And finally, this court can say that probation is for people who have tried to make right the wrongs they committed, and who are one day at a time fighting for their lives. I would close by reading the words of one of the people that had written in support of Brian, who said that given everything that Brian has endured, physically, mentally, and emotionally, since that fateful night in 2002 when he broke his back, one thing has not changed: his compassion and his love toward others. He has always been there serving others, always been a friend to others, always been giving to others, even while hurting himself. And this person concluded by saying, Brian Wasson is one of the strongest, bravest men I know. I ask this court to exercise its discretion, to honor Brian's confession, his recovery, and his potential for redemption by granting him a sentence of probation. I thank the court for its courtesy in traveling out here from North Platte. I thank the state for its considerable courtesy since we first began working on this case in September. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shaluka. Mr. Wasson, is there anything that you would like to say on your behalf?
Just very briefly, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
I haven't had the opportunity to speak, and my work in recovery is more selfish, perhaps, than the addiction was itself. But I was selfish. I exploited a trust that I was given by the community and my peers, supervisors, everybody, and I harmed all of them. And for that, I'm forever remorseful for that. This court has my assurance that I continue to work a program of recovery. I'm currently working the steps that have identified those I've harmed and will begin to make amends for those harms. And again, I would reiterate, I appreciate the court's travel and Mr. Guiney's travel as well and work as the Nebraska State Patrol.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Wasson. Okay, thank you for all of the argument. I appreciate it. As you've seen, I've been taking copious amounts of notes and paying attention. Mr. Guiney, is there any reason why the court should not proceed to sentencing at this time?
No, Your Honor.
Ms. Chalupa? Thank you. The court has reviewed the pre-sentence investigation report and the recommendations provided in that report. I've also considered all of the sentencing factors set out in Nebraska Revised Statute Section 29-2260. One of the character letters provided as part of the PSI said that Mr. Wasson's mistakes do not erase the contributions he made to the Scottsbluff and Geary communities, and that person is right. Everyone who wrote me a letter, regardless of the sentence they wanted to see, said that Mr. Wasson is a stand-up guy who regularly goes above and beyond to help neighbors, friends, children, and strangers. Mr. Wasson's accomplishments, however, do not erase his mistakes. The court has carefully considered the full picture in this matter, including Mr. Wasson's outstanding character as well as his outstanding mistakes. Having regard for the nature and the circumstances of the crime, the history, character, and condition of the defendant, the court does find that imprisonment of the defendant is necessary because a lesser sentence would depreciate the seriousness of the defendant's crime and promote disrespect of the law. I find that there are substantial and compelling reasons for a period of incarceration, which include the fact that the defendant was not just a police officer in Scottsbluff, but he was a captain in the force. He was just below the chief and in a position of power and authority over his fellow officers. That Mr. Wasson interfered with at least 3 active cases due to his actions. That Mr. Wasson took evidence from other cases and provided it to his dealer, potentially putting the drugs back out on the street. And then the sheer amount of drugs and cash that were taken, which doesn't include approximately 15 to 20 years of stolen drugs from the drug take-back program, which was not calculated. I will let you know, when considering my sentence, I started out, I essentially attributed 1 day for every unit of drugs that was stolen. Calculating that would have resulted in a period of incarceration of 68 months. However, in considering this incarceration, I did know some of the mitigating factors that have impacted my decision. First off, including the LSCMI report or score, which indicates just a moderately increased risk to reoffend. The fact that Mr. Wasson has no criminal history prior to this offense. As Ms. Chalupa said, all of his actions are completely attributable to an addiction that was known, that was involuntarily foisted upon Mr. Wasson. The fact that the addiction did stem from injuries sustained in the line of duty, and that Mr. Wasson has been honest and very cooperative in the investigation process and admitted to his wrongdoings unprompted. I also will note that in considering the maximum amount of sentence, I have considered adding time for the cases, the active cases that were affected by Mr. Wasson's actions, and thereby tampering with the prosecution of those cases. So in conclusion, I will say that I'm going to sentence the defendant to a period of 40 months, a minimum of 40 months of incarceration, a maximum of 68 months of incarceration. The jail sentence imposed herein is to run concurrent on both counts. I am going to adopt the agreement regarding restitution and sentence the defendant to pay restitution in the amount of $7,000 even. Would that be payable to the Scottsbluff Police Department? I'm not exactly sure how to do that since it was evidence technically not belonging to the department.
Right, Your Honor. I think the balance left would be this, is it $1,720?
Yeah.
And yeah, it would be paid back, as I believe it was evidence in some format, so it would be given back to the Scottsbluff Police Department.
Thank you. So I'm going to order the defendant to pay restitution in the total amount of $7,000. I understand there is a check in the amount of $5,280 that is either in the possession of the State Patrol or the Scottsbluff Police Department. That would make the remaining balance due $1,720. I'm going to note the total amount in my order because that is the total amount restitution that I am ordering. And then I believe that there can be cooperation to reflect the $5,280 that has already been paid. The defendant will be responsible for the costs in this matter. The defendant's bond, if any, is released and any amount not subject to a lien may be applied to the payment of court costs and fines that have been imposed in this matter. Am I missing anything, Mr. Guinan?
Not from the state, thank you.
Ms. Chalupa? Okay. So for the purposes of the record, this is a final appealable order. Mr. Wasson, I am going to remain in custody of the Scottsbluff County Sheriff's Department. Thank you everyone for coming today. Again, I really appreciate the arguments and the perspectives from everyone. I know this is a rough case that has affected countless people that aren't even here in the room, and I appreciate all of the information. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you.